Imagine for a moment that you are a Persian soldier in the year 480 BC. You are part of the biggest army the world has ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of men marching under the command of the great King Xerxes. You have crossed entire continents and conquered powerful cities. And now you are heading for a small rocky peninsula in southern Greece. Your commanders tell you that you will face only a few thousand rebellious Greeks at a place called Thermopylae. It should be easy, right? But then you hear whispers among the troops. Whispers about warriors who never retreat. About men who would rather die than surrender. About soldiers trained from birth for one thing: war. These are the Spartans. And today we will discover why facing them was every ancient army's worst nightmare. To truly understand the terror the Spartans inspired in their enemies, we must go back to the beginning. Sparta was not just an ordinary Greek city-state. It was a carefully designed war machine where every part of society was focused on creating the most effective warriors the ancient world had ever known. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was a result of hundreds of years of social and military changes shaped by geography, politics, and a unique idea of what it means to be a warrior. Sparta's history begins in the dry mountains of the Peloponnese, a region that was not good for farming like other parts of Greece. The first Spartans, known as Dorians, arrived in this region around the 11th century BC. Unlike other Greek city-states that became rich through sea trade and diplomacy, Sparta was surrounded by difficult terrain and unfriendly neighbors. This unique geography forced the Spartans to make a basic choice. They could try to compete economically with cities like Athens and Corinth, or they could specialize in something no other Greek city-state dared attempt, transforming every citizen into a professional warrior. Their decision changed not only the fate of Sparta but the course of all Western history. Around the 8th century BC, the Spartans put in place a radical social system known as the Great Retra. This wasn't just a set of laws. It was a complete restructuring of society with one goal: to create the most efficient military machine the world had ever seen. Under this system, the entire population was divided into three distinct classes: the Spartiates, who were citizen soldiers by birth; the Perioeci, who were free men but not citizens responsible for trade and crafts; and the Helots, who were essentially serfs tied to the land, who provided the farming labor necessary to sustain society. This social structure allowed for something never seen before in human history: a warrior class completely dedicated to the art of war, freed from any need to work for a living. While other Greek soldiers were farmers, merchants, or artisans who took up weapons when necessary, the Spartans were professional soldiers from the moment they could hold a spear. But what truly made the Spartans unique wasn't just that they could dedicate themselves entirely to war. It was how they chose to do so. The Spartan educational system, known as the Agoge, was unlike anything else in the ancient world. It wasn't a school in the way we understand it today, but rather a decade-long program of military and mental training that shaped not only a man's combat skills but also his very identity. This system began even before the birth of a Spartan child. When a Spartan woman became pregnant, she wasn't just carrying a baby. She was carrying a future soldier of the state. The birth of a child in Sparta marked the beginning of a harsh selection process that would determine their worthiness to become a Spartan warrior. Immediately after birth, the baby went not into the loving arms of its mother, but into the hands of experienced elders who carefully examined the child. They looked for signs of strength, health, and physical vigor. Any child showing signs of weakness, deformity, or illness was considered unfit to serve the Spartan state. The fate of these children was instantly sealed. They were taken to the slopes of Mount Taygetos and left to die. This process may seem cruel by modern standards, but for the Spartans, it was a practical necessity. Sparta could not afford to feed and train soldiers who would not be capable of fighting well. Every resource, every moment of training, every grain of food had to be invested in creating warriors who could defend the city-state against enemies who often outnumbered them. Childhood selection ensured that only the most physically fit would have the chance to become full Spartans. For those babies who passed the initial inspection, the first years of life were a period of careful preparation. Spartan mothers, unlike mothers in other parts of Greece, were encouraged to be physically active and strong. They believed that strong mothers would produce strong children. Spartan women participated in physical exercise, athletic competitions, and ate high-protein diets. They were not confined to their homes as in other Greek cities, but were considered essential partners in raising the next generation of warriors. At the age of 7, the true transformation began. This was the moment when Spartan boys were separated from their families and handed over to the state to begin the agoge. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of 7-year-olds, some still crying for their mothers, being gathered into groups and marched to military camps where they would spend the next 13 years of their lives. There was no turning back. There were no weekend visits home. There were no holidays or vacations. From that moment on, these children belonged to Sparta. The agoge was divided into phases, each designed to develop specific parts of a Spartan warrior. The first phase, from ages 7 to 12, focused on building basic physical and mental toughness. Children learned to handle hunger, cold, pain, and tiredness. They slept on the hard ground, wearing only a thin cloak, even in the harsh winter of the Peloponnese Mountains. Food was deliberately scarce. Not so scarce that the children starved to death, but enough that they were constantly hungry and had to struggle to get additional food. This intentional food scarcity served multiple purposes in Spartan training. First, it taught children to work well even when their basic needs were not fully met, a crucial skill for soldiers who might have to march for days on limited food. Second, it encouraged them to be creative and resourceful. Spartan children were expected to add to their food by stealing additional food. But there was a catch. If they were caught stealing, they were severely punished. Not for the act of stealing, that was considered a useful skill for a soldier, but for being clumsy enough to be captured. This seemingly contradictory system of punishment shows a basic characteristic of Spartan education. It taught not only physical skills, but also the kind of tactical and mental thinking necessary for war. A Spartan soldier needed to be able to live off the land, sneak into enemy territory, and get resources by any means necessary, all while remaining undetected. Children who could steal food without being caught were showing exactly the kind of practical intelligence that would be valuable on the battlefield. As the children grew older in the agoge, their training became progressively more intense and specialized. At 12, they entered the second phase of the program where the focus shifted to more direct combat skills. It was at this age that they began to learn the weapons that would define their lives, the long spear known as the dory, the circular shield called the aspis, and the short sword known as the xiphos. But more important than any individual weapon was learning to fight as part of a united unit. The phalanx formation was the heart of Spartan military tactics, and mastering this formation required years of coordinated practice. A Spartan phalanx was not just a group of individual soldiers fighting close together. It was a single organism where each warrior was like a cell in a larger body. Each soldier had to know not only how to use his own weapons well, but how to coordinate his movements with the men beside, in front of, and behind him. A single mistake, a moment of hesitation, or a lack of coordination could break the formation and result in the deaths of dozens of comrades. To teach this coordination, young Spartans practiced military maneuvers for hours every day. They learned to move as a unit, to hold their positions even under extreme pressure, and to obey commands instantly and without question. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to completely trust the men at their side. In a phalanx, your life literally depended on the skill and courage of the soldiers around you. If the man next to you lowered his shield or broke formation, you would be exposed to enemy attacks. This mutual dependence created bonds between Spartan warriors that went far beyond simple military friendship. The Spartan system understood that creating effective soldiers required more than just physical and tactical training. They needed to develop the mental and emotional strength necessary to face the horrors of ancient warfare. Combat in ancient times was not a distant and impersonal experience like modern warfare can be. It was brutal, up close, and personal. Warriors fought so close that they could feel their enemy's breath, see the fear of determination in their eyes, and hear their cries of pain. Surviving and winning in this type of combat required a special kind of mental toughness. To develop this toughness, the agoge subjected young Spartans to a series of tests and rituals designed to break down any mental weaknesses and rebuild their minds as instruments of war. One of the most famous of these tests was known as diamastigosis, a brutal ritual in which young Spartans were publicly whipped until they bled. The goal was not cruelty, but rather to teach future warriors to handle extreme pain without breaking or showing signs of weakness. During this ritual, hundreds of Spartans gathered to watch as young men were tied to an altar and whipped with an iron rod. The mental pressure was huge, not just from the physical pain, but from the knowledge that the entire community was watching to see if you would break. Those who screamed, begged for mercy, or fainted were considered unfit to become full warriors. Only those who endured the torture in silence, often to the point of death, were considered worthy of the title of Spartan. This type of conditioning may seem extreme, but it served a very specific military purpose. In the heat of battle, soldiers often faced situations where pain, fear, and chaos could paralyze or break them. A Spartan warrior who had been trained from childhood to handle extreme pain and keep his composure under intense pressure had a big mental advantage over enemies who had not gone through such conditioning. When a wounded Persian soldier screamed in pain and panic, a wounded Spartan soldier continued fighting in complete silence. Beyond physical and mental conditioning, the Agoge also emphasized the development of skills we would today call emotional intelligence and leadership. Young Spartans learned to control not only their own emotions, but also to read and influence the emotions of others. They studied how to inspire confidence in their comrades, how to intimidate enemies, and how to keep a unit's morale even in the most desperate circumstances. A crucial part of this emotional education was learning to cope with death, both the possibility of their own death and the reality of the death of close comrades. Young Spartans were exposed to death from an early age. They saw peers die during particularly brutal training, watched public executions of rebellious helots, and participated in ritual hunts where they were expected to kill both animals and humans. This constant exposure to death was intended to make them less sensitive to the mental trauma that could paralyze them in combat. But perhaps the most mentally sophisticated aspect of the Spartan system was its approach to motivation. The Spartans understood that soldiers fight best when they have something worth dying for. To create this motivation, they built a system of values and social identity that made being a Spartan warrior not just a job, but the very definition of human worth in society. From a young age, young men in the Agoge were taught that their lives were only valuable to the extent that they served well as soldiers. They heard constant stories of Spartan heroes who had died gloriously in battle, and of cowards who had been kicked out of society for showing fear. They learned that death in combat was not something to be feared, but rather the most honorable fate a man could have. The famous phrase of Spartan mothers to their sons going off to war, "Return with your shield or on it," was not just an expression of support, but a clear statement that cowardice was worse than death. This mental programming created soldiers who literally couldn't think of retreat or surrender. For a fully trained Spartan, breaking in battle wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a fundamental denial of everything he'd been taught to value about himself. This is one of the reasons the Spartans were so effective in seemingly impossible situations. While other soldiers might calculate the odds and decide that a strategic retreat was wise, the Spartans simply didn't have that mental option available. At age 20, after 13 years in the Agoge, young Spartans faced their final test, a trial that would determine whether they would become full citizen soldiers or be given a lesser status for the rest of their lives. This test wasn't a written exam or a demonstration of skills in a controlled environment. It was a real mission where the young men were sent alone into the field with orders to survive for a set period using only their skills and wits. During this final test known as a crypteia, young Spartans were expected to live off the land, avoid detection, and often perform specific missions such as killing helots who were considered dangerous or potential leaders of revolts. This was not just a test of survival skills. It was also a test of their willingness to do anything necessary to protect the Spartan state, no matter how morally questionable it might be. Those who successfully completed the crypteia were finally considered full Spartans, Spartiates, and earned the right to bear arms as citizen soldiers. But even then, their military education was not complete. From their 20s to their 30s, they continued intensive military training, now focused on advanced tactics, leadership, and specialization in different aspects of warfare. Only at 30 was a Spartan considered mature enough to marry and raise a family. And even then, their military obligations remained their top priority. The result of this decade-long educational system was a type of soldier that simply didn't exist anywhere else in the ancient world. An adult Spartan wasn't just trained for war. He was mentally incapable of working in any other way. They didn't know how to be farmers, merchants, or artisans because they had never been exposed to these activities. They didn't know how to negotiate or compromise because they had been trained to view anything less than total victory as unacceptable failure. They were, in the most literal sense, human war machines. But creating individual super soldiers was only part of what made the Spartan army so powerful. What truly set them apart from other ancient armies was how they worked together as a military force. Spartan organization and tactics represented hundreds of years of military evolution refined through actual combat experience against a variety of enemies. The basic Spartan military unit was the Ennomosha, composed of about 35 men. This was not just an administrative division. It was a military family. The members of an Ennomosha lived together, ate together, trained together, and fought together. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses intimately. They knew how each comrade would react under different types of pressure. This close familiarity allowed for a level of tactical coordination that was impossible to achieve with soldiers who didn't know each other well. Multiple Ennomoshae formed a Pentecostes of about 140 men, and multiple Pentecostes formed a Lochos of about 560 soldiers. At the top of the hierarchy was a Mora, a unit of about 2,240 men commanded by a pole march. This organizational structure allowed considerable tactical flexibility. Commanders could quickly reorganize their forces for different combat situations without losing unity or effectiveness. But organization alone didn't explain Spartan superiority. What truly made them devastating was their use of the phalanx formation. The phalanx wasn't a Spartan invention. Other Greek city-states used it as well. But the Spartans refined and perfected it in ways that transformed it from a basic military tactic into a nearly invincible weapon of war. A typical Spartan phalanx consisted of 8 ranks of soldiers, each carrying a spear about 2.5 meters long and a circular bronze shield about a meter in diameter. The shield was not just defensive equipment. It was an important part of Spartan offensive tactics. Each soldier held his shield with his left arm in such a way that it protected not only his own left side but also the right side of the man next to him. This overlapping shield created a nearly impenetrable wall of bronze that could absorb arrows, spears, and sword attacks. The key to this formation's effectiveness was absolute discipline and coordination. When a Spartan phalanx advanced, it moved as a single organism. The soldiers in the front rank kept their spears pointed forward, while those in the back ranks held their spears at angles that allowed them to extend beyond the front rank. This created a wall of spearheads that extended several meters in front of the formation. The mental impact of facing an advancing Spartan phalanx was devastating. Imagine being in the enemy army and seeing hundreds of bronze warriors marching toward you in perfect sync, their shield gleaming in the sun, their spears forming a deadly forest of bronze tips. The sound of their sandals marching in unison, the rhythmic clang of their spears against their shields, and the war chants they sang created an intimidating noise that could break enemy morale before the fight even began. But the true genius of Spartan tactics wasn't just in the defensive formation. It was in how they used it offensively. Once the phalanx made contact with the enemy lines, the battle became a matter of literal pushing. The Spartans at the back of the formation used their shields to push the men in front of them, creating huge pressure that drove the front ranks into the enemy lines. This tactic, known as a thismos, or pushing, turned the battle into a pure contest of strength, endurance, and determination. Soldiers at the front of the formation had to hold their positions while being attacked by enemy spears while at the same time trying to pierce the enemy with their own weapons. Those behind had to keep constant forward pressure even as their comrades in front were being killed and wounded. The Spartans' advantage in this type of combat was overwhelming. Their years of physical conditioning had made them stronger than ordinary soldiers. Their mental training allowed them to keep discipline and coordination even as men were dying around them. Most importantly, their absolute willingness to die rather than retreat meant they never broke under pressure, a crucial factor in a tactic that depended on maintaining constant forward pressure. Spartan equipment was also better than that of most ancient armies. Their shields were made of the finest bronze available, forged by skilled craftsmen who spent their lives perfecting the art of creating military equipment. Their spears were made of carefully selected wood and balanced for maximum effectiveness in close combat. Their armor, while lighter than that of some armies, was specifically designed to allow maximum mobility without sacrificing vital protection. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Spartan equipment was its standardization. While other ancient armies often consisted of soldiers using a variety of weapons and armor, depending on their personal wealth or where they came from, every Spartan soldier wore basically identical equipment. This standardization wasn't just for looks. It had important tactical implications. It meant that each soldier knew exactly what to expect from his comrades in terms of weapon range, shield protection, and movement speed. Spartan logistics were also better than those of most ancient armies. While many armies relied on complex supply trains or living off conquered land, the Spartans had developed systems to keep their forces in the field for long periods with minimal supplies. Their soldiers were trained to work on reduced food, to find water in hostile territory, and to keep their equipment in combat condition even after weeks of campaigning. This logistical superiority gave the Spartans a big strategic advantage. They could carry out military campaigns into territories where other armies could not operate well. They could keep sieges for longer periods and, crucially, they could respond quickly to threats in different parts of their territory without having to worry about vulnerable supply lines. By the time we reached the Greco-Persian Wars of the early 5th century BC, all these Spartan advantages came together to create situations where relatively small Spartan forces could face much larger armies with a realistic chance of victory. The Persian Empire represented the kind of challenge for which the Spartan military system had been designed, a powerful enemy with vastly superior resources that relied on raw numbers rather than individual soldier quality. The Persian army that invaded Greece in 480 BC was impressive in size. Ancient sources, though possibly exaggerated, speak of Persian forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even millions of men. Even if we reduce these numbers to more realistic estimates, we are still talking about an army that outnumbered any force the Greeks could gather by a margin of at least 10 to 1 and possibly much more. But size wasn't the only Persian advantage. The Persian Empire controlled vast economic resources that allowed it to equip its soldiers with quality weapons and armor, maintain extensive supply networks, and recruit military experts from across the known world. The Persian army included not only native Persian soldiers, but also groups of Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and dozens of other nationalities, each bringing their own military specialties. The Persians also had significant technological advantages. Their archers were considered among the finest in the ancient world, capable of releasing clouds of arrows that could darken the sky. They had heavy cavalry that could break infantry lines with shock charges. They had engineers specializing in siege warfare who could build machines capable of breaking through the walls of even the most heavily defended cities. Perhaps most importantly, the Persians had experience. The Persian Empire had conquered territory stretching from India to the Black Sea through decades of successful military campaigns. Its generals had faced all types of enemies and tactics. They knew how to adapt their strategies to different terrains and situations. When they marched into Greece, they had every reason to believe this would be just another routine conquest. From the Persian perspective, Greek resistance seemed almost laughable. The Greek city-states were small, often fighting among themselves, and capable of fielding military forces that were tiny compared to what the Persians could gather. When Persian spies reported that the Greek defenders at Thermopylae Pass consisted of only a few hundred Spartans and a few thousand other Greeks, it must have seemed as if the resistance would be crushed within hours. But the Persians didn't fully understand what they were marching against. They had faced Greek soldiers before. Greek mercenaries had served in Persian armies, and some Greek city-states in Asia Minor had been conquered during previous Persian expansions. But they had never faced Spartans fighting on their own territory, defending their homes and families on terrain that favored their specific tactics. The Thermopylae Pass was chosen by the Greek defenders precisely because it neutralized many of the Persian advantages. It was narrow enough that only a small part of the Persian army could attack at the same time, eliminating their numerical advantage. The rough terrain made cavalry charges impossible. The steep walls on both sides of the pass meant that Persian archers could not easily attack the Greek position from the side. More importantly, the terrain forced a battle of the kind the Spartans were perfectly suited for, close-quarters infantry combat where discipline, training, and determination mattered more than numbers. At Thermopylae, all Persian technological and numerical advantages were reduced to a simple test of which side could hold a better battle line in close combat. When the battle began, the Persians quickly discovered they were facing a different type of soldier than anything they had faced before. Their first units to attack were elite troops known as the Immortals, Persian soldiers considered the best the empire had to offer. These men had conquered cities and defeated armies across the known world. They expected the few Greeks in the pass to break and flee when faced with the elite Persian military. Instead, they found themselves against a wall of bronze and iron that simply wouldn't budge. The Spartans met the Persian charge in perfect formation, their spears forming a deadly forest that pierced anyone who came too close. When the Immortals tried to use their greater mobility to attack the Spartan position from the side, they found terrain made such moves impossible. When they tried to use archers to break the Spartan formation from a distance, they discovered that Greek shields could absorb arrows indefinitely. More disturbing to the Persians was the Spartans' mental reaction to combat. Persian soldiers were used to enemies who screamed, showed fear, or at least some normal emotional reaction to the extreme violence of ancient warfare. The Spartans fought in complete silence, their faces hidden by bronze helmets, responding to their officers' commands with mechanical precision, even as men died around them. This silence wasn't just intimidating, it was deeply disturbing on a mental level. Persian soldiers who had seen many battles later reported that fighting Spartans was like fighting ghosts or demons. There was no mental satisfaction of seeing fear in the enemy's eyes. No screams of pain to confirm their attacks were causing damage. No signs that the Spartans were normal humans who might eventually break under enough pressure. As the first day of the battle at Thermopylae progressed, it became clear to the Persian commanders that they were facing a tactical problem they had not anticipated. Their usual tactics, using archers to break enemy formations, flanking with cavalry, or simply overwhelming the enemy with superior numbers, were not working. The narrow pass stopped their cavalry. Their archers could not get through the Spartan shield wall, and throwing more soldiers into the fight did not help when only a few could fight at once due to the terrain's limitations. Worse still, the Persians were suffering major casualties while the Spartans seemed virtually untouched. Each wave of the Persian attack left dozens of bodies scattered in front of the Spartan line, while the Greek formation remained solid and seemingly tireless. 4 Persian soldiers used quick and relatively bloodless victories against intimidated enemies. This experience was deeply demoralizing. The Spartan tactical effectiveness at Thermopylae perfectly showed why facing these warriors was every ancient military commander's nightmare. It wasn't just that they were skilled soldiers. Many ancient armies had skilled soldiers. It wasn't just that they were well-equipped. The Persians also had quality equipment. What made the Spartans unique was their combination of superior technical preparation, extreme mental conditioning, and a social system that made them literally incapable of thinking about defeat. When Xerxes, watching the battle from an elevated position, saw his best troops repeatedly pushed back by a much smaller force of Greeks, he must have begun to realize that he had seriously underestimated his opponents. Historical sources suggest that he initially believed Greek resistance would last a few hours at most. Instead, as the first day turned to night without major Persian progress, it became clear that this battle would be very different from what anyone had expected. The night after the first day of fighting at Thermopylae must have been a time of serious reflection for the Persian forces. They had brought the largest army the world had ever seen to conquer a few thousand rebellious Greeks, and yet they had failed to advance even a few meters. Their casualties were mounting while the Greek defenders seemed as strong as at the start of the battle. For soldiers used to easy conquest, this experience was deeply unsettling. But the Persian problems went beyond simple tactical considerations. The failure to quickly break Greek resistance was beginning to have broader strategic effects. One of the great strengths of the Persian military system was its ability to keep huge armies in the field through superior logistics. But even the Persian supply system could not sustain hundreds of thousands of men indefinitely without major progress. Every day that passed without victory was another day that their supplies were used up, their lines of communication stretched, and their troops became less trusting of their commanders. Worse still, news of the standoff at Thermopylae was spreading throughout the ancient world. Greek city-states that had considered surrendering to the Persian advance were reconsidering their positions. Subject peoples of the Persian Empire who had accepted Persian rule as inevitable were beginning to wonder if their conquerors were truly as invincible as they seemed. The failure to quickly crush Spartan resistance was undermining the image of invincibility that was a crucial tool of Persian power. On the second day of the battle, Xerxes tried different tactics. He sent specialized troops from different parts of his empire, each with their own combat techniques and equipment. Scythian archers with their powerful composite bows, median heavy infantry with their scale armor, picked soldiers from various satrapies who had proven their worth in previous campaigns. But the result was the same. Every unit that attacked the Spartan position was pushed back with heavy casualties while the Greek line remained unshaken. What the Persians didn't fully understand was that they were facing not just superior soldiers but an entire military system that had been refined specifically for this kind of situation. The Spartans weren't just making up defensive tactics. They were executing strategies that had been practiced and perfected for generations. Every aspect of their formation, from the spacing between soldiers to the timing of troop rotations, had been calculated for maximum effectiveness in long combat. Spartan troop rotation was particularly sophisticated. While other armies often kept the same men in the front line until they were exhausted or dead, the Spartans had developed systems for bringing fresh soldiers to the front of the formation while moving tired men to back, all without disrupting the integrity of their battle line. This ability to keep relatively fresh soldiers at the front of the battle gave them a big advantage in long engagements. Their close combat techniques were also superior. Decades of training had taught each Spartan not only how to use their weapons well, but how to fight in close coordination with their comrades. They knew how to position their shield for maximum mutual protection, how to coordinate spear strikes to get through enemy armor, and how to keep formation even when the ground was slippery with blood and covered with bodies. Perhaps more importantly, they had developed mental techniques to keep morale and discipline during long combat. The Spartans understood that ancient warfare was as much a mental battle as a physical one. Soldiers who could keep their resolve and confidence through hours of brutal combat had huge advantages over enemies who gradually became discouraged, tired, or terrified. Spartan morale-building techniques included ritual chants, constant reminders of fallen comrades in need of avenging, and an honor system that rewarded exceptional bravery in combat. But perhaps most effective was their understanding that soldiers fight harder when they believe they have the unconditional support of their comrades. The Spartan promised to never abandon a wounded comrade, never retreat without orders, and never accept defeat, no matter how desperate the situation, created an environment where every soldier knew he could absolutely count on the men around him. This mutual trust had important practical effects on the battlefield. Spartan soldiers could take tactical risks that would be unthinkable for other armies because they knew their comrades would support them no matter what. They could keep attacking even when wounded because they knew other Spartans would take their positions. They could fight to the death because they knew their family and city would honor their sacrifice. For the Persian soldiers facing this formation at Thermopylae, the contrast with their own military system must have been obvious and demoralizing. The Persian army was made up of groups from many different nationalities, each with its own commanders, traditions, and motivations. While this gave the Persian army flexibility and specialization, it also meant that individual soldiers often did not know the men fighting alongside them well. A Syrian archer might not know whether he could trust an Egyptian spearman to protect his side. A Median soldier might not be sure whether his Persian allies would stand and fight if the battle turned against them. This lack of unity became a crucial factor in intense combat situations. When Persian soldiers saw their units suffering heavy casualties against the Spartan line, they could reasonably ask themselves whether it was worth continuing to fight for causes that were not their own alongside men they did not know in a battle that seemed increasingly unwinnable. For the Spartans, such questions were literally unthinkable. They had been conditioned from birth to view anything less than total victory or an honorable death as unacceptable. As the second day of the battle at Thermopylae drew to a close without major Persian progress, the mental impact on Xerxes' army was becoming severe. Soldiers who had marched into Greece confident of their numerical and material superiority were beginning to doubt the possibility of victory. Commanders who had planned to be in Athens within days were facing the possibility that they might be trapped in this pass for weeks. The strategic implications of the situation were serious. The Persian plan for the conquest of Greece depended on momentum, on quickly crushing any resistance and forcing the remaining Greek city-states to submit before they could organize a coordinated defense. Every day lost at Thermopylae was a day for the Greeks to prepare, gather allies, and fortify defensive positions elsewhere in Greece. It was in this context that news arrived that would change the course of the battle. A local Greek named Ephialtes had offered to show the Persians a mountain path that would allow them to outflank the Spartan position. This information offered Xerxes exactly what he needed, a way to bypass the natural fortress that had made the few Greek defenders so effective. But even with this tactical advantage, the Persians would still face the basic problem of how to deal with soldiers who simply refused to accept defeat. The mountain route might allow them to surround the Spartans, but surrounded soldiers who prefer death to surrender do not automatically become less dangerous. In many cases, they become more desperately effective. When Leonidas, the Spartan king commanding the Greek forces, received word that the Persians had found a way to outflank his position, he faced a decision that would define not only the outcome of the battle but also the historical perception of Spartan military effectiveness. He could try to withdraw his forces to fight another day, preserving his trained soldiers for future battles, or he could stay and fight to the death, knowing that such a sacrifice would have symbolic and strategic value that could inspire Greek resistance throughout the Greek world. Leonidas' decision perfectly shows what made the Spartans so mentally effective as soldiers. For a rational military commander in almost any other culture, preserving trained soldiers to fight another day would be the obvious choice. But the Spartan value system didn't allow for such a calculation. For the Spartans, retreating when they could still fight was a basic violation of everything they believed about honor, duty, and courage. Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek allies, allowing them to withdraw to fight in future battles. But he and his 300 Spartans remained, along with a few Theban and Thespian volunteers who chose to stay and die with them. This was not an emotional or impulsive decision. It was a calculated strategic choice based on the understanding that sometimes the symbolic value of a last stand outweighs the preservation of military resources. The third and final day of the battle at Thermopylae became a definitive demonstration of both the effectiveness and limitations of the Spartan military approach. Surrounded and outnumbered by impossible odds, the remaining Spartans fought with ferocity that impressed even their enemies. Persian sources report that the last Spartans continued fighting even after their spears were broken, using swords, then daggers, and finally fighting with fists and teeth. This final stand was not just dramatic bravado. It had big practical effects on the broader Persian military campaign. The heavy casualties the Persians suffered at Thermopylae, while numerically sustainable, had a disproportionately large impact on the morale of their troops. Soldiers who had seen their best units destroyed by a few Greeks could no longer have complete confidence in Persian invincibility. More importantly, the Spartan sacrifice at Thermopylae became a powerful symbol that inspired Greek resistance throughout the Greek world. City-states that could have surrendered peacefully to the Persians instead chose to fight, motivated by the example of the 300 who chose death over submission. The propaganda value of this last stand was invaluable to the Greek cause. But Thermopylae was just one battle in a longer war. And to truly understand why the Spartans were so feared, we need to look at their broader military campaigns and their impact on the balance of power in the ancient world. Thermopylae showed Spartan effectiveness in defensive combat against impossible odds. But the Spartans were also masters of offensive warfare, capable of projecting military power far beyond their own borders. In the decades following the Greco-Persian Wars, Sparta emerged as a dominant military power in the Greek world. Its victory in the Peloponnesian War against Athens and its allies showed that its military superiority was not limited to desperate defensive situations but extended to the conduct of complex strategic campaigns lasting decades. During the Peloponnesian War, Spartan armies repeatedly proved they could defeat numerically superior forces through a combination of tactical superiority, superior discipline, and the mental advantages their uniquely trained soldiers provided. In battles like Mantinea, the Spartans showed that even when facing other experienced Greek hoplites, their superior phalanx formation and combat discipline gave them decisive advantages. What made the Spartans particularly effective in long warfare was their ability to keep discipline and morale even during campaigns lasting months or years. Other Greek armies were made up primarily of citizen soldiers who had farms, businesses, or other civic responsibilities to which they had to return. Long campaigns created economic and social tensions that eventually forced these armies to return home. The Spartans had no such limitations. As full-time professional soldiers supported by the labor of helots, they could remain in the field indefinitely without economic pressure to return home. This ability to sustain military operations for long periods gave them huge strategic advantages over enemies who eventually had to choose between continuing to fight and meeting the needs of their civilian economies. Their psychological warfare techniques were also highly developed. The Spartans understood that war was not just about winning battles, but about breaking the enemies who would continue resisting. They developed specific tactics designed to maximize the mental impact of their victories and minimize their enemies' ability to recover from defeats. One of these tactics was their approach to the treatment of prisoners in conquered populations. While many ancient armies killed or enslaved indiscriminately, the Spartans often used calculated displays of force to break resistance without having to fight unnecessary battles. Cities that surrendered quickly were often treated with relative leniency, while those that resisted faced complete destruction. This policy created powerful incentives for potential enemies to surrender rather than fight. The Spartans were also masters of mobile warfare. While their phalanx formation was most effective in direct combat, they developed tactics for using their heavy infantry in guerrilla operations, surprise attacks, and flanking maneuvers that maximize their advantages while minimizing their enemies' opportunities to use numerical superiority. Their nighttime operations were particularly feared. The Spartans trained extensively for combat in darkness, developing techniques of silent communication, navigation without light, and coordinated attacks that allowed them to attack enemy camps with devastating surprise. Enemies could never be certain they were safe after dark, creating constant mental tension that reduced morale and effectiveness. Spartan military intelligence was also better than that of most of their contemporaries. They kept extensive networks of spies and informants throughout the Greek world, allowing them to anticipate enemy movements and exploit political and military weaknesses in rival city-states. This superior intelligence often gave them decisive strategic advantages before battles were even fought. Perhaps most importantly, the Spartans had developed a sophisticated understanding of how warfare connected with politics and diplomacy. They understood that lasting military victory required not only winning battles but also creating political conditions that made future resistance less likely. Their alliances with other city-states were carefully structured to maximize their military power while minimizing the chances that allies would turn against them. This strategic sophistication was clear in how the Spartans dealt with helot revolts. Rather than simply crushing revolts through brute force, they often used combinations of displays of force, economic incentives, and political manipulation to prevent revolts from gaining momentum. When force was necessary, it was applied in ways calculated to discourage future resistance without creating unnecessary martyrs. The long-term effectiveness of the Spartan military system can be seen in its ability to maintain dominance over the Peloponnese for over 2 centuries. During this period, no individual city-state or coalition of city-states successfully challenged Spartan military power. Even when Sparta faced revolts or invasions, its basic military superiority remained intact. This long dominance was not simply a result of tactical superiority on the battlefield, but reflected the effectiveness of the total Spartan system, military, political, economic, and social, in sustaining military power on a regional scale. The Spartans had created not only a superior army but an entire society optimized for projecting and maintaining military force. But the Spartan system also had built-in weaknesses that would eventually contribute to its decline. Their reliance on a relatively small citizen soldier population meant they could not sustain heavy casualties indefinitely. Each Spartan killed in battle represented years of training and investment that could not be easily replaced. Their social rigidity also limited their ability to adapt to changing conditions. The system that made the Spartans so effective against traditional enemies became a liability when they faced new types of military challenges for which they had not specifically trained. The rise of Macedonia under Philip II and Alexander the Great posed precisely this kind of new challenge. The Macedonians had carefully studied Spartan tactics and developed specific military innovations designed to neutralize traditional Spartan advantages. Their Macedonian phalanx formation used longer spears that could reach beyond Spartan spears in range. Their heavy cavalry could exploit weaknesses in the Spartan formation that had not been a problem against previous enemies. More importantly, the Macedonians had adopted many of the best features of the Spartan military system while avoiding some of its limitations. They trained full-time professional soldiers like the Spartans but recruited them from a much larger population base. They emphasized discipline and unity like the Spartans but kept tactical flexibility that allowed them to adapt to different combat situations. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, where the band army under Epaminondas defeated a Spartan force, marked the beginning of the end of Spartan military dominance. This defeat showed that Spartan tactics, while still powerful, were no longer invincible when faced with enemies who had developed specific counter-tactics. But even in decline, the Spartan military legacy continued to influence the development of the art of war in the ancient world and beyond. Many of the innovations the Spartans pioneered, professional military training, unit discipline, psychological warfare, advanced tactical coordination, became standard features of effective armies throughout the ancient world. The Romans, who would eventually conquer both Greece and the ancient Persian Empire, studied Spartan tactics extensively and included many elements of the Spartan system into their own military organization. The Roman emphasis on discipline, standardized training, and loyalty to the unit can be traced directly to Spartan influence. Even today, modern military practitioners study the Spartans not only for historical interest, but because many of the basic principles that made the Spartans so effective, the importance of rigorous training, unit unity, strong leadership, and mental preparation for combat, remain relevant to contemporary military operations. What makes Spartan military history unique is not only that they were exceptionally effective soldiers, but that they showed how a small society could achieve and maintain military superiority over much larger enemies through extreme specialization, tactical innovation, and a total commitment to military excellence. They proved that in war, quality can triumph over quantity when that quality is developed systematically and scientifically. For the Persian soldiers who faced Spartans at places like Thermopylae, the lesson was clear. They were fighting not just skilled individual soldiers, but the product of an entire social system dedicated to creating the most effective warriors possible. Each Spartan they faced represented decades of specialized training, genetic selection, mental conditioning, and tactical preparation that simply had no equal anywhere else in the ancient world. This was the true source of the terror the Spartans inspired in their enemies. It wasn't just that they were difficult to kill. Many ancient soldiers were brave and determined. It wasn't just that they were well-trained. Other armies also had experienced soldiers. What made the Spartans unique was that they represented the application of human intelligence, social resources, and political will to the task of creating soldiers of maximum effectiveness. Facing the Spartans meant facing not just individual warriors, but the entire might of a civilization that had chosen to specialize entirely in warfare. It was like a farmer with homemade tools trying to compete against a modern industrial farming operation. The difference was not just one of individual skill, but of an entire systematic approach to solving the problem of military effectiveness. For the Persian Empire, used to conquering enemies through a combination of diplomacy, superior resources, and overwhelming force, the Spartans represented a basically different kind of challenge. They could not be bought, intimidated, or outmaneuvered using methods that had worked against other enemies. They had to be met on their own terms, direct combat, where training, discipline, and determination mattered more than anything else. This is why facing Spartan warriors was the Persian Empire's worst nightmare. Not because the Spartans were invincible, history eventually proved they weren't, but because they forced their enemies to fight exactly the kind of battle that maximized Spartan advantages while minimizing the advantages that had made the Persian Empire so successful in other situations. When a Persian soldier looked across the battlefield and saw a line of Spartan warriors waiting in perfect formation, he was seeing not just enemies to be defeated, but the end product of one of the most extreme experiments in military social engineering the world has ever witnessed. Each of those bronze warriors represented the complete dedication of an entire society to the art of war. And this ultimately is why facing the Spartans was so terrifying. Because they proved that war was not just about individual courage or even numerical superiority, but about which society was most willing to sacrifice everything else in the pursuit of military perfection. The Spartans had made this choice completely, and the consequences of that choice echoed across the battlefields of antiquity for centuries. As we think about this extraordinary military history, we cannot help but recognize that even the mightiest empires and most disciplined warriors in human history were in the end mortal before the greater forces that govern the destiny of nations. The Lord God in his providence allowed civilizations to rise and fall, empires to conquer and be conquered, and even the proudest warriors to find their limits. The story of the Spartans reminds us that while human training, discipline, and courage can reach extraordinary heights, there's always a higher authority that determines the ultimate course of human events. Their victories and defeats, like all in history, were part of a greater plan that goes beyond our human understanding, reminding us of the necessary humility before the divine greatness that governs all human affairs.